Good afternoon. Welcome to our listeners. I am Julia Lau. I'm editor at Fulcrum, the commentary and analysis website of the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. I'm also a senior fellow with the Indonesia Studies program here. With me today is Dr. Tara Davenport. Tara is assistant professor at the National University of Singapore's Law Faculty. Welcome, Tara.
Hi, Julia. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Before we start, I will read out your very, very impressive bio. Just briefly. Tara has a Bachelor of Laws from LSE, a Master's in Maritime Law from the National University of Singapore, and her LLM and Doctor of Juridical Science are from Yale Law School. She is Senior Research Fellow at the Center for International Law at NUS and Deputy Director of the Asia Pacific Center for Environmental Law, or APSEL, and a member of 2 journal editorial boards. She is also on the Executive Council of the Asian Society of International Law. She is co-rapporteur for the International Law Association's Committee on Submarine Cables and Pipelines, and a member of the Legal Working Group on the Deep Seabed Mining Liability. That's all very technical sounding. The reason why we have Tara here with us is a couple of weeks ago, she wrote a brilliant piece that was picked up after that by the Straits Times for Fulcrum, talking about the importance of UNCLOS, and we'll talk about what UNCLOS is, to Singapore. And we at Fulcrum worked with the team at what's called Blue Security, which is a project that aims to strengthen the analysis of maritime security challenges across the region, especially in the Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia. And this is coordinated by a consortium. It's led by Dr. Beck Stratting at La Trobe Asia. It's also supported by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade's Maritime Exchange Program 2022 to 23. So before we launch into the questions, I'm going to give our listeners sort of a below Law 101 definition, I suppose, of what UNCLOS is. So today we are discussing what I would think is one of the most significant pieces of international legal history and law in commemorating the upcoming 40th anniversary of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or what we call UNCLOS, UNCLOS. In 1982, a comprehensive legal framework was established for all marine and maritime activities after a long, hard-fought series of international meetings that had their roots all the way back in 1949. UNCLOS came into force in November 1994 after Guyana became the 60th nation state to ratify the convention. Under UNCLOS, new mechanisms for dispute resolution were created, and we can go into this in a bit more detail if we wish. But maybe let me start with the first question then, Tara, if you can. For the average layperson, intelligent, educated, but unfamiliar with international law or even UNCLOS itself, how would you describe the convention and its impact on our day-to-day lives? So why do we care about UNCLOS 40 years down? About safety or security at sea, about passage at sea, and more generally, perhaps for the younger generation, our ocean environment today?
Okay, thank you, Julia. That is a great question. And also, my mother actually read the piece in the Straits Times last week. But she said, I didn't understand what you're talking about. What is UNCLES? What is UNCLES?
No, we have failed.
Yes, I thought it was a failure on my part for not being more clear in why UNCLOS is important. And I think the best analogy I can think of is in Singapore. We have national laws. Those national laws govern the conduct of Singapore's citizens, backed by a judicial system and a police force. International law, and you've also ably explained it, governs the relations between states and how they should behave with each other. And there are several sources of international law. You have your customary international law, which is state practice, that is developed into custom and has been accepted by states as custom. And then, of course, the other major source of international law are international conventions, which are sort of equivalent to binding contracts between states. Right, so international law governs the conduct of states in the international arena. There are many international conventions in force today that address a whole range of issues. The 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS and not UNCLES, is an example of an international convention that governs the conduct of states in the oceans. Right, and I think it's important to remember that the oceans is a global commons. It's an area of shared space, right? It is very difficult to occupy it like you do land, to draw boundaries like you do land. And in the period leading up to the Law of the Sea Convention, you had a period of anarchy at sea. You had states making unilateral claims to ocean space because of the resources they believed that this ocean space provided them. Some of these claims overlapped with each other. Some of these claims restricted the activities of other states, such as navigation or fishing. And this posed a huge problem, right? So there was, chaos and anarchy at sea. I probably, overstated slightly, but there was a real need to have a clear legal order. And this is what the Law of the Sea Convention attempted to do, to establish, and Ambassador Koh described it as a constitution for the oceans, in which that was universally accepted and which all states would comply with, right? And this would give a certain degree of predictability, certainty, and that is what the law aims to do. And I can't overemphasize, and I'll end soon, I can't overemphasize the broad range of issues that the Law of the Sea Convention covered. It's 320 articles over a period of 9 years, and actually even before that, the negotiations had already begun, and it was a package deal, right? States had to accept losses, and states had to accept wins, right? And everyone accepted that, and I think that was a huge accomplishment on the behalf of the international community. And in terms of how UNCLOS impacts our day-to-day living, Singapore is a major flag state. As a flag state, its interest is to ensure that its vessels can go to any port, deliver goods, collect goods. Without UNCLOS, we would not be able to do this. Can you imagine if each state adopted different regulations for their flags? And Singapore flagged vessels would have to comply with these different regulations each time they went into a different port. This would be a huge onerous burden on flag states, on vessel owners. And therefore, UNCLOS provides some form of uniformity, certainty, and I think this has facilitated Singapore's development as a flag state.
That's beautifully said. And I think the law students at NUS today are in very good hands. Professor Davenport teaching them maritime law. Beautifully summarized. And I'll make an international politics professor interjection to say anarchy, as understood by international lawyers and international political scientists, anarchy means the absence of order. Less so, in a way, chaos, although certainly there was chaos at sea, like you said, prior to UNCLOS. But your answer also brilliantly sets up the next question, which is, and this is also related to your article, about Singapore's role in forging UNCLOS, like you said. And for people who don't know, there were multiple rounds of international conferences, namely UNCLOS 1, 2, and 3, which started in 1973. Professor Tommy Koh, as you mentioned, or Ambassador Tommy Koh, and the Singapore delegation were an integral part of this. Can you give our listeners some insight into how significant you think it was, or Singapore thinks it was, that we of all countries, right, a small island nation state, played a role, and a particularly interesting and key role, together with other nation states, some of which at the time were very newly independent states post World War II. How important was it for this group of states to come together and, like you said, formulate this package deal, right?
Great. I am very interested in history and legal history, particularly. And I think it's important for the listeners to know that the negotiations of the Law of the Sea Convention really took place against a fascinating backdrop of Cold War politics, decolonization, newly independent states, sort of calls for a global redistribution of resources, right? Singapore became independent in 1965 after sort of tumultuous merger with Malaysia. In 1969, 1970, which is sort of when the seabed negotiations began, we were really a very tiny, newly independent state, right? We had very few international lawyers, and this is really a credit to Professor Tommy Koh and Professor Jai Kumar, as well as Judge Chow Hick Tin, who were really called upon to be the experts in this huge negotiations, right? And as you said, we were a tiny country. We were not the economic powerhouse that we are now. We were a little red dot, right? In the face of larger maritime states such as the US and the USSR, even in the face of our larger neighbors, such as Indonesia and Malaysia, right? But we always articulated our national interests. We always pushed across our national interests. And this was not an easy undertaking, right? And I use the example in the piece that I did of the resolution, right? Again, we were a small country asking the UN General Assembly to push through this resolution in order to serve our national interest of highlighting what extensive claims to maritime jurisdiction would do to, for example, the common heritage of humankind, which was supposed to belong to everybody. So I think we showed a remarkable amount of courage, of guts in pushing our national interests across. And I think this has, the experience was invaluable, I think, for diplomats who participated in that negotiations.
And they provided multiple case studies for law students.
Yes,
multiple generations to study.
For sure. And I mean, it's so interesting when you read the history, like many of the compromises were done sort of privately, right? In informal negotiating groups, and so you don't have actually that history to look upon and to read to see exactly what those provisions meant or what was intended, right? But if you didn't have those informal negotiating groups, which you probably wouldn't get away with now, in the interest of transparency and openness, but if we didn't have that, you probably wouldn't have a convention. Right? Because it's the interpersonal relationships between these diplomats that really, and the strength of some of these personalities that really got the convention through.
That's a good point. So you did mention Indonesia and other regional neighbors, and the next question I had was about archipelagic states, and maybe we have to define that first. What on earth is one of these things? But the interest of such states, and in ASEAN or Southeast Asia, we have two very major ones, Indonesia and the Philippines. How would these states have slightly different, maybe maritime interests from an island nation like us, or from a landlocked state like sorry, which one is the landlocked?
Laos.
Laos. Yes. And how important was it for UNCLOS or UNCLOS, not uncles, to cover this set of rights that are actually explicitly listed, right, in part 4 of the convention?
Yeah, I mean, I think Indonesia and Philippines, they were one of the greatest beneficiaries of the law of the sea regime. And it also is, due to their, and particularly Indonesia's, as well as Philippines, diplomacy efforts to basically convince other countries to recognize the archipelagic regime. Prior to the Law of the Sea Convention, right, Indonesia and Philippines are a group of islands, right? They're a group of islands. Prior to the Law of the Sea Convention, they did not have control over much of the water surrounding the islands, right? So you could draw a territorial sea around individual islands, but beyond that, in the waters in between the islands, they had no control, right? And you had so much vessel traffic, you had military vessels passing through, you had commercial vessels passing through, which would be a threat to their, or they perceived as a threat to their political, economic, and environmental security. Right. So, of course, they were very interested in advocating for what they call the archipelagic regime, whereby the islands, you're able to draw straight baselines, so straight points around the islands, and enclosed within these straight baselines, you would have your archipelagic waters, which would be subject to archipelagic state sovereignty and control. Right. So this is the idea that of the group of islands as one unity, right? Politically, economically, geographically, right? And I think this was very important for both Philippines and Indonesia as newly independent states to have that sort of recognition that all their islands constituted one unit vis-a-vis other states, and to have the control of these waters, right? For resources, for navigation, for environmental perspectives. The compromise, of course, was that other states would have the right of passage, archipelagic sea lanes passage, where they would be able to traverse through the waters. And this passage could be regulated by Indonesia and Philippines. From Singapore's perspective, and one of the other contributions that Singapore has made is the Article 51 of the Law of the Sea Convention, which preserves existing rights of neighboring states of Indonesia within archipelagic waters. So your traditional fishing rights, your rights to lay submarine cables, as well as your traditional legitimate activities that you were conducting prior to the adoption of the archipelagic regime. And Singapore and Indonesia cooperated to come together to draft that particular provision, Article 51.
That's great. Here I would interject and recommend strongly to our listeners, go and Google straight baselines. Before that, Google territorial sea. Before that, Google nautical miles.
Okay.
And I think no worries. And I say that because for me, one of the first things that interested me about maritime law when I studied law of the sea was all these terms that in sort of ordinary language sound very, very innocuous, have such weighty repercussions, as you said, on a country's sovereignty or a country's perception of who is in it or out of it, who owns what in terms of the sea and the waters, as well as stuff that's on the seabed, if you will. So, for the layman to understand that we are able to claim a territorial sea up to 12 nautical miles, for a lot of people, that's sort of like, yeah, but of course what, But then to actually then think, how do you then encapsulate that in an international legal convention, universally understood and obeyed? And that's a whole other thing. And then on top of that, then, we also have regimes like the exclusive economic zone, which is 200 nautical miles. And under that, the continental shelf. And then beyond that 200 nautical mile mark, you can actually extend it. So a lot of people who don't study international law will look at all this and like, why does it have to be so like that, right?
Yeah.
But I think you captured beautifully how it is that important. It is that important to be technical in one way, but at the same time, how Singapore, the Philippines, Indonesia, all the other Southeast Asian countries came to an agreement together with the rest of the world to delineate all these different territories and jurisdictions was important. And I guess that brings us to question 4, which is about the international impact. So beyond Singapore, beyond our region immediately, one elephant in the room is that certain countries, who shall not be named, have not ratified the convention, even after close to 40 years. Some did it immediately. And the ones who have not ratified sometimes still do not seem likely to do so immediately anyway, or in the near future. Is this still problematic, or like you said, has it already passed into customary international law, that it's no longer such a problem? Do we now have, if you will, solid international legal norms and other practices that are now considered to be binding, even for states that haven't ratified UNCLOS?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question. Yes, I know. This is, perhaps I can name the country who shall not be named, which is, of course, the major country would be the United States.
Yes.
And, they participated very intensely in the negotiations. They are a major maritime power. They stood to benefit a lot from the Law of the Sea Convention in terms of the continental shelf regime, and as you said, the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone regime. They did not become a party because of they were going to become a party, but then because of concerns related to the deep sea bed mining regime in Part 11 of the Law of the Sea Convention, there was some provisions which they felt were very onerous and were very sort of antithetical to their free market capitalist viewpoints. And they decided not to ratify the Law of the Sea Convention at the last moment. And I think, as I mentioned in the piece as well, Prof. Koh was the president of the negotiations at that time, and he was trying his very best is to try and broker some form of compromise. Ultimately, it was not possible. The United States and some other developed countries at that time decided not to ratify the Law of the Sea Convention. Frankly speaking, the reasons for them not ratifying it no longer exist. Right, the regime that they objected to in Part 11 relating to the common heritage of humankind, the deep seabed mining regime, it has actually been amended and changed to reflect more what they wanted. Right, so their stated objections no longer exist. I think there is a minority of politicians in the US that view international law and international institutions with suspicion. They feel as it's surrendering their sovereignty if we become party to these international conventions. And I fear that this will be the case for a long time now, particularly as the American politics becomes so polarized. From a legitimacy perspective, I do think that it is very important that the US becomes a party to UNCLOS, especially because they have proclaim themselves as defending UNCLOS, through their freedom of navigation operations. They are asserting the rights under UNCLOS that have been recognized by UNCLOS. And I think it's always easy for other countries to say, what right do you have to do this? You're not even party, you're not even at the table, right? From a practical perspective, I agree that most of the provisions which are important to them, such as freedom of navigation, the EEZ regime, have become customary international law. They have consistently acknowledged that it is customary international law and they are bound by it. But at the same time, I would also caution to say that not every single piece of the law of the sea convention is customary international law, right? To determine and identify what is customary international law, you have to have sort of long-standing, consistent state practice. It's very vague, right? And usually international courts and tribunals will say, yes, that's customary international law, without really identifying why. So again, it is difficult to say in certainty that all parts of UNCLOS are customary international law. But for present purposes, the most important provisions in relation to the rights and obligations of the law of the sea convention, I say, are customary international law, and the US would still be bound by that. And I think they've taken that position as well. But I think from a sort of legal order perspective and a normative perspective, it is important for them to become parties.
But you don't think it's likely, or
I don't. Well, I don't know. I really, yes, I know it's so unpredictable. I never thought that.
You've gone to Yale, and
yes.
I've gone to Georgetown, and I suspect both of us have had similar experiences with realist international relations types who look at international law as sort of the fluff on the sheep, and look at it as a fictitious creature, which I take umbrage against. But
good. I'm so glad.
Preparing for this podcast, I actually read about the first 111 articles.
Wow.
Of the 320 articles you mentioned. It's like visiting an old friend. But I want to end on this maybe sort of more hopeful question about the future that you think UNCLOS will have. The preamble begins, or the convention, if you will, begins, a legal order for the seas and oceans, blah, 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 to facilitate international communications and then promote peaceful uses of the seas and oceans, the equitable and efficient utilization of their resources, the conservation of their living resources, and the study, protection, and preservation of the marine environment. So the last question is really, some of the other authors in the same Blue Security 40th anniversary series that we've had, now we have about 4 country pieces up. Your piece, a piece on Vietnam. The first 2 were Indonesia and Malaysia. Next week, we're going to have some other countries added to the list. Every week until, I think, mid-October, we have a piece coming out.
It's wonderful.
Many authors have pointed out the need for UNCLOS to maybe be updated or even renegotiated, saying that some of the challenges that the world faces today on maritime law and maritime issues were never envisaged by the framers of this convention, which I actually, looking at the preamble, I think they kind of knew that stuff was going to happen. So the last question is more of a, what do you think UNCLOS will be like, say, another 40 years from now when, when you're retired and
hopefully
somebody else is teaching international maritime law? What do you see ahead, I guess?
This is, I think for international lawyers, particularly law of the sea scholars, this is a perennial question, right? Will UNCLOS or does UNCLOS stand the test of time? You were taught by Prof. Beckman. Yes. He's an institution in NUS. He's taught, Jessup Mutas, everybody, right?
That's right.
And I had to say, I am an ardent fan of the Law of the Sea Convention. Sure. I'm not impartial at all in that particular perspective. But just because when you look at the convention, it is really a feat of legal ingenuity. Right, and this is why I think that it's an amazing convention, and it gives so much fruit for lawyers, right? And and I would, I completely agree that there are so many challenges now, right, that UNCLOS maybe wasn't drafted to deal with, right? I do agree with you that actually there was a hint of it, and they foresaw it. They didn't expressly mention it, right? In some cases. But at the same time, I do think that it has the flexibility to be interpreted in an evolutionary manner. And I that sounds very vague, I know. But again, I come back to, firstly, it is very hard to amend. Yes. Right, the amendment procedures in the Law of the Sea Convention are very, difficult to comply with. Renegotiating, renegotiating would be to open the whole thing again. I also don't think that's feasible. I think the best way would be to, number one, as we've done 3 times now, or doing 3 times, which is to adopt a implementing agreement, whereby UNCLOS still retains its centrality. These agreements are adopted under the Law of the Sea Convention, and they elaborate provisions which were mentioned in the Law of the Sea Convention, but were not fully detailed, right? So you had that with fisheries, the Fisheries Stocks Agreement in 1995. You had that with the 1994 Implementation Agreement relating to common heritage of humankind, and now you have that with the marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. And really, what always struck me was this centrality of the Law of the Sea Convention. It is always done under the Law of the Sea Convention. I think the fundamental nature of the Law of the Sea Convention in terms of the maritime zones, that is not going to change, right? And I also think that the Law of the Sea Convention actually has a very robust environmental protection regime, backed up by a dispute settlement procedure that actually gives it teeth as compared to other conventions. And you can see more and more states are being held responsible for not complying with their marine environmental protection obligations. And that is a lot of well, not a lot, but several cases have done that now, building up the UNCLOS provisions and giving them flesh, right, to really give some sort of strength to these obligations. And I think this is another important role that we forget that dispute settlement plays, right, of really elaborating upon these obligations, telling states you've undertaken these obligations, these are what these obligations mean, right? And then this is another way in which UNCLOS can be, I guess, adapted, right, to meet changing circumstances, right? And I think even with sea level rise, which is another huge problem that we have, and there's a whole debate on whether UNCLOS allows states to sort of adopt permanent baselines, so that if there is sea level rise, their maritime zones and their baselines remain permanent. There is a huge debate upon that. But I honestly believe that UNCLOS provides the framework, the basis, and from there we interpret UNCLOS in a way that best suits the international community, right? And this will be, of course, and it has to be done, we have to have input from many stakeholders. There are processes, there are conversations to be had, but it is, UNCLOS still remains the basis from which we start with, at the very least. Yeah.
I feel we need like another whole podcast to talk about mechanisms and dispute resolution. Let's end with a nice sort of slightly more personal question that's not about UNCLOS per se. How did you get interested in international law, and how did you end up devoting, if you will, your professional life to it, as both as a young person, but in particular maybe a young woman, if you want to care to talk about that?
I'm not so young anymore. I feel very sad. But yes, that's well, I mean, I practiced shipping law when I first graduated from NUS. Was always very interested in maritime law, shipping law. My father had a shipping company. And then I joined a shipping firm, Raja and Tan, had a very interesting time there. And then I actually, because I loved international law at university, I joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for a couple of months. Really enjoyed my stint there, but unfortunately my father passed away, and I had to go and help run his company. And that's when I really got involved in sort of the private aspects of shipping law, of maritime law. And then I rejoined practice again after I sort of resolved my father's company's problems, and just really got interested in international law and shipping law and wanted to pursue that. And thereafter, I just did a master's at NUS and maritime law, and just started being a researcher at the Center for International Law, and decided that I really wanted to be an academic. I didn't enjoy practice as much as I did, thinking about these issues, thinking about how I can contribute to resolving some of the international problems that we face.
Yeah.
And yeah, just went down the academic career path from then. So it has been an interesting journey. I've had great mentors, both male and female, who've encouraged me, who've given me support, and very happy that I'm able to do this, that I have the privilege of being able to teach and to research this very interesting, fascinating area.
That's great. That's a beautiful answer. Do you have any publications that are forthcoming that you're working on right now?
I've got a well, in academia it's publish or perish, right? So
not necessarily, not nowadays.
No, really.
You can podcast your way to fame.
NUS is always telling me publish more, right? So I've got several. My PhD was actually on deep seabed mining.
Right.
So I'm actually very interested in the role of corporate actors in ocean governance. So I have a book project on that, that's what I'm spending my time on. So deep seabed mining, submarine cables, but really how corporate actors who are private actors and are not subject to international law per se, but actually have a huge say in the formation and the implementation of international law. So that's really my research focus at the moment.
That's great. Well, thank you very, very much for joining us. I dare say this is one of the more interesting conversations I've had on international law. Smooth sailing, and all the best for what you're doing, and keep on doing it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Julia. This has been really enjoyable. This is fun. Maybe I'll play this for my students as a sort of introductory.
Yeah, that can be a whole lecture or something.
Yes.
All right. Thanks.
Okay. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.